The rain has stopped for now, and somewhere past the village fence a kitchen fire holds its small orange light against the dark. It is late the way it always is at this hour, and if you are settling in with the light already low, then you are exactly where this story wants you. Come in, let the evening close around you. Tonight we go back to a world where the sun decided the shape of a life and a single pot on a single fire decided almost everything else. Here is what is at stake in that world right at the start. A wrong decision about food does not simply mean an unpleasant winter, it means a family does not survive it. In medieval Europe, for the vast majority of people working someone else's land, the margin between enough and not enough was thinner than a single failed harvest, and the meal that filled their bowl morning after morning was not a matter of taste. It was the difference between a household that saw spring and one that did not. Picture a woman standing at a hearth before dawn, somewhere in the English countryside in the 1300s. She is already awake before the birds because the fire has gone down in the night, and it needs coaxing back to life before the cold fully claims the room. Beside her hangs an iron pot, and inside it is a thick dark stew that has been simmering in one form or another for longer than she can easily remember. Some of what is in that pot today was in it 3 days ago. She adds a handful of oats, perhaps a fistful of dried peas softened. Overnight, whatever green has survived at the edge of the garden. She does not measure anything. She has made this same meal with these same motions since she was a girl, learning at her own mother's hearth. Outside, her husband is already dressing for the fields because the Lord's land does not wait for anyone's comfort, and their own strip of ground, the small patch that keeps them alive, will only be worked once his labour is spent. She ladles the stew into 2 wooden bowls and into a third for the child still sleeping near the fire. And this more or less exactly, this is what all 3 of them will eat again this evening and again tomorrow and again the day after that for years without a clear end in sight. It would be easy to look at a life like hers and call it small or grim or simply sad, and there is real hardship inside it, hardship we will not soften. But there is also something else here, something quietly remarkable, and it is the real question this story wants to sit with tonight. Why this meal specifically? Why the same combination of grain and legume and whatever the season allowed, eaten by millions of people across an entire continent for hundreds of years, without meaningful variation? Was it truly only poverty, only a lack of imagination or opportunity as it is so often assumed to have been? Or was that daily bowl something closer to a quiet piece of engineering built by generations of trial and hard-won knowledge to keep a family alive through a world that offered no guarantees? The evidence, once you start looking closely at it, tells a story more layered than either simple assumption allows. Before we go further into that story, I want to ask something small of you because it genuinely helps this kind of work continue. If this is the sort of history you've been looking for, the real past told without rushing and without flinching, but also without cruelty, take a moment to subscribe and to leave a like. It costs you nothing, and it means a great deal on this end. And if you have a moment, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from tonight and what drew you to a story like this one. I read every one of them, and I am always curious who is out there in the dark with me. Now let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. To understand that pot on that fire, we have to understand the world that built it, because nothing about medieval peasant food happened by accident. It grew out of a system of land, labour and obligation that had been tightening and settling into place across Europe since roughly the 9th century. A system historians now call manorialism, though. The people living inside it would simply have called it life. Land belonged in the eyes of the law to lords, to the church, to distant nobility who might never once set foot on the soil their tenants worked. The peasants who actually turned that soil, planted it and harvested it were bound to it in ways that shaped every hour of their existence. Most owed labour days of unpaid work on the Lord's own fields before they were permitted to tend the smaller strips that fed their own families. Most owed a portion of whatever they grew handed over at harvest, regardless of how thin that harvest had been. What was left after all of that is what a family actually had to live on, and what survives in the historical record suggests that for enormous numbers of people, what was left came down almost entirely to grain, legumes, and whatever could be coaxed from a small garden plot near the home. This was not a world of refrigeration of transport networks of food, travelling in from distant regions to fill gaps in a local harvest. What grew nearby was what existed. What could be stored through a long winter without spoiling, without needing constant tending, was what a family could actually count on. And so the shape of the meal itself, that thick, warm, endlessly simmering pottage, was not a failure of creativity. It was closer to a solution, refined over centuries by people with no written science, to guide them only the accumulated memory of what had kept their parents and grandparents alive. We will spend the hours ahead moving through that solution piece by piece. We will walk the fields themselves and the strange, disciplined rotation of crops that made this way of eating possible in the first place. We will sit inside the mechanics of the pot itself and understand why a meal that never fully emptied and never fully stopped cooking was in its own quiet way a form of insurance against hunger. We will look at what happens when the harvest fails and at the harder truths of what scarcity actually did to a household, and we will bring in something the peasants themselves never had access to, the evidence written into their own bones and teeth and into the surviving records their landlords kept of exactly what these people grew, owed, and ate. Historians, it turns out, still argue over parts of this story, and we will sit honestly inside that disagreement rather than pretend it does not exist. But it begins here in a small kitchen, before sunrise, with a woman stirring a pot she has stirred 1,000 times before, feeding a family whose survival depends on a meal that never really changes. It is a small, ordinary moment, and like so much of the true history of the medieval world, it is far larger and far more human than it first appears. A household like hers did not exist in isolation. It sat inside a web of obligations so complete that almost nothing in her day, from the hour she woke to the crops she was permitted to grow, existed outside its reach. To understand why that bowl of pottage looked the way it did, we have to step back from the hearth for a while and look at the structure that built the hearth itself, and the field beyond it, and the entire quiet machinery of medieval rural life. By the time our woman is stirring her pot in the 1300s, the system historians call manorialism has already been settling into place across much of Europe for close to 400 years. It did not arrive all at once as a law or a decree. It grew slowly, region by region, out of the collapse of older Roman structures and the need for local protection in a fractured world, until it hardened into something close to the default condition of rural life. At its centre sat the manor, an estate that might belong to a lord, a bishop, an abbey, or occasionally a distant king who had never once walked its fields. Around that manor spread the land itself, divided in ways that tell us a great deal about how thoroughly ordinary people's lives were shaped by decisions made far above them. Some of that land, usually the richest and most convenient, was kept entirely for the lord's own use. This was called the domain, and it was work not by hired labour in any modern sense, but by the unpaid hours of the peasants themselves, who owed a set number of days each week, sometimes 3, sometimes more, depending on the season and the customs of that particular manor, to plough, sow and harvest ground that would never feed their own children. Only after those obligations were met could a family turn to their own strips of land, scattered narrow plots spread across the open fields rather than gathered into one convenient block, a deliberate arrangement meant to ensure that no one household monopolized the best or the worst soil. It is a detail that surprises many people when they first hear it. A peasant family did not simply farm one plot near their home. Their livelihood might be spread across a dozen thin strips, some near, some a considerable walk away, each contributing its share to what would eventually fill that pot on the fire. Layered on top of this labour obligation was another kind, entirely one measured not in days but in produce. Tithes owed to the church typically claimed roughly a tenth of everything a family grew or raised. Rents owed to the lord might be paid in coin where a local economy allowed it, but far more often, especially in earlier centuries, they were paid in kind, in grain, in eggs, in a portion of whatever the land had produced that year. Add to this the countless smaller dues that appear again and again in surviving manorial records, a fee to use the lord's mill rather than grind grain by hand, a fee to use his oven rather than bake at home, even in some regions a payment of fee simply for permission to marry off a daughter. Historians studying these records describe a rural economy in which almost every transaction, every use of shared resources, carried some small toll back toward the lord. None of this left much room for surplus. What remained after labour, after tithe, after rent, after every accumulated small fee is what a household actually had to eat, and what survives in the record suggests that for a majority of medieval peasants that remainder was thin enough that grain and legume prepared in the most efficient way possible became not a preference, but something closer to a mathematical necessity. And yet it would be a mistake and a real distortion of the truth to imagine this system as static or uniform across the whole of medieval Europe, because it was neither. The obligations owed by a peasant in the English Midlands differed meaningfully from those owed by a tenant farmer in Flanders or Bavaria, or the rice-growing valleys of northern Italy, where different crops, different climates, and different local customs shape the terms of survival in their own particular ways. Some regions saw tenants gain more freedom earlier, able to pay obligations in coin rather than labour, which in turn gave them slightly more control over what they grew and kept. Other regions held tightly to unfree labour and rigid custom for centuries longer. What unified this enormous uneven patchwork of rural life was not a single set of rules, but a shared underlying pressure. The constant grinding need to produce enough surplus to satisfy obligations above, while still holding back enough to survive the year below. Scholars still debate exactly how much variation exists manor to manor, and how much genuine agency an individual peasant family actually held within a system that looks from a distance almost entirely rigid. There is a detail here that tends to surprise people, something rarely mentioned outside of specialist agricultural history, and it concerns the soil itself. The land a peasant family worked was rarely land they could improve for their own long-term benefit in any meaningful way, because the underlying ownership never shifted from the lord, no matter how many generations of a single family worked the same strips. There was little incentive in the strictly economic sense to invest heavily in soil that would never fully belong to you or your children. And yet the archaeological and documentary record shows something quietly moving in response to this reality. A deep accumulated folk knowledge of crop rotation, fallow periods, and soil management that peasant communities developed and passed down, not through written agricultural science, which barely existed yet in any accessible form, but through generations of careful communal observation. The three-field system that would come to define so much of medieval European agriculture, dividing land each year between a crop for autumn planting, a crop for spring planting, and a portion left fallow to recover, was not handed down from some distant authority. It emerged region by region from ordinary people paying close attention to a soil they did not own but depended on completely. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reshapes how we might think about that repeating bowl of pottage. It was not simply what remained after a rigid extractive system had taken its share. It was the product of real hard-won agricultural intelligence refined across centuries by people with no formal education, who nonetheless understood their land with a precision that modern soil scientists studying the same fields today have found genuinely difficult to improve upon in certain respects. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how this knowledge spread, whether through village councils, through the customary law of individual manors, or simply through the unspoken authority of elders who had watched enough failed harvests to know what worked. But the pattern itself, appearing again and again across regions with little direct contact with one another, suggests something close to a shared hard-earned wisdom, built entirely from necessity. It is this soil worked under this system, governed by these obligations, that would ultimately decide what grew, what survived the winter, and what ended up night after night in a family's shared bowl. And it is to that soil and to the particular rhythm the medieval calendar imposed upon it that this story turns next, because the fields themselves were about to reveal a discipline as exacting in their own way as anything imposed by a lord's ledger. Walk out past the edge of any medieval village in early spring, and the land itself begins to tell you a story. One written not in words, but in the careful, almost ritual division of the ground. To the eye of someone from our own century, it might look like a patchwork with no particular logic, strips of dark-turned soil, beside strips of pale stubble, beside strips of nothing at all, simply resting grazed lightly by whatever animals the village owned in common. But to the people who lived by it, this pattern was as precise and as consequential as any calendar ever devised, and it governed in the most direct way imaginable exactly what would end up in that pot on the fire. By the years we are speaking of, the system historians call the three-field rotation had spread across much of northern and western Europe, though not, it is worth saying, clearly everywhere and not all at once. The land belonging to a village, or more precisely the open arable land beyond the immediate garden plots, was divided into three large sections. In one, a family planted a crop for the autumn harvest, most often wheat or rye, the grains that would become the dense, dark bread eaten on better days or ground finer and reserved when possible for special occasions or for payment of certain dues. In a second section, they planted for a spring harvest oats, barley, and crucially legumes such as peas and beans, plants that did something the medieval farmer could not have explained in scientific terms, but understood with total practical certainty. They left the soil richer than they found it. The third section rested entirely left fallow for the year, grazed by village livestock, whose manure would help restore what 2 seasons of grain had drawn out of the ground. The following year the sections rotated. What had rested became autumn planting, what had grown wheat became spring legumes, what had grown legumes became fallow, and so it continued year after year, a slow, deliberate cycle that treated the soil less as a resource to exhaust and more as a partner to be managed with patience. We now understand through modern soil science precisely why this rotation worked as well as it did, though. The people practicing it had no access to that language. Legumes, such as peas and beans, host particular bacteria in small nodules along their roots, bacteria capable of pulling nitrogen directly from the air and fixing it into the soil in a form that later crops can use. A field of peas, in effect, quietly fertilizes itself and the field that follows it, entirely without anyone understanding the chemistry involved. Medieval farmers did not know about nitrogen fixation. What they knew through generations of close observation was that land planted with peas or beans one year produced a noticeably stronger grain harvest the next, and that knowledge, however it was arrived at, shaped the entire structure of their agricultural year. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. An enormous continent-spanning agricultural system, feeding millions of people for centuries, rested on a piece of biological wisdom that would not be scientifically explained until the 19th century, and yet was practiced with real precision by people who had never set foot in anything resembling a laboratory. This is also where the specific character of the peasant diet begins to make a different kind of sense. The crops best suited to this rotation, the ones that thrived in the soil conditions the system produced and that stored well through a long winter without refrigeration of any kind, were precisely the crops that filled that daily bowl. Oats and barley, hardier and less demanding than wheat, tolerated poorer soil and shorter growing seasons, which made them dependable in a way that finer grains often were not. Peas and beans, beyond their soil-restoring properties, dried easily and kept for months, providing a source of protein that required no pasture, no slaughtering, no risk of losing an animal to disease before it reached the table. Wheat, the grain most associated in the modern imagination with medieval bread, was in practice often the crop most likely to be owed away as rent or tithe or reserved, and sold for coin, because it commanded the highest value. What a family actually kept for itself, more often than popular imagination assumes, leaned heavily toward the humbler grains and legumes that the rotation produced most reliably, precisely the ingredients made up a bowl of pottage. There is a detail here that surprises even people who think they know this history reasonably well, and it concerns just how communal this entire system actually was. The open fields were not fenced into private, individually managed plots in the way a modern farm might be organized. A single family's strips were scattered often deliberately across different parts of each of the three great fields, which meant that decisions about what to plant and crucially when to plant it could not simply be made by one household acting alone. The whole village needed to agree in effect on the timing of the rotation, because a family attempting to plant out of step with its neighbours risked having its unfenced crop trampled by everyone else's grazing livestock during the fallow period, or losing access to shared plough teams and shared labour. At the moment it was needed most. Village custom, enforced through manorial courts and long-standing local tradition, effectively synchronized an entire community's agricultural calendar. In this sense, even the rhythm of eating the same meal day after day connected outward to something larger than any single household, a shared discipline that bound an entire village together in a single unbroken cycle of planting, tending and harvest. Scholars still debate how uniform this three-field system actually was across medieval Europe, and the picture that emerges from careful regional study is considerably messier than the tidy textbook version often suggests. In parts of southern Europe where rainfall patterns and soil conditions differed sharply from the north, a two-field system persisted for far longer, with land alternating simply between a single crop and a single fallow year, producing a somewhat different balance of what a household could realistically grow and store. In certain regions of Eastern Europe, evidence suggests rotations that blended elements of both systems according to purely local tradition, adapted over generations to conditions that no single agricultural rulebook could have anticipated. The evidence remains incomplete on precisely when and how the three-field system spread from its earliest documented centres in the Frankish heartlands outward across the wider continent, and archaeologists and historians continue to piece together that picture from scattered manorial records, pollen analysis taken from ancient field soils, and the occasional fortunate survival of a detailed medieval account book. What is not in dispute is the underlying logic, a slow, patient management of scarce and demanding soil built entirely around keeping a population fed through years that offered no guarantees and very little margin for error. And this finally brings us back to that pot simmering quietly on its wall, filled with the specific grains and legumes this rotation was built to produce. It becomes difficult once you understand the field behind it to see that meal as simply a symptom of poverty or a lack of imagination. It looks instead like the direct logical output of an entire agricultural system refined over centuries that had learned through nothing but careful observation and hard experience how to coax a reliable harvest from soil that would otherwise have failed a family within a single bad season. The sameness of the meal was not separate from the sophistication of the system. It was the system made visible one spoonful at a time, but a system. This precisely balanced, this dependent on cooperation, predictable weather, and a delicate cycle repeated correctly year after year, carries within it a particular kind of vulnerability, one that the fields themselves could do nothing to guard against. What happens when a single link in that careful communal chain breaks? When the rain fails to come at the expected moment or comes in a flood that will not recede is a question this same land and the people bound to it would come to know with a clarity no historian's account could fully soften. Grain, once it leaves the field and enters the household, does not simply become one thing. This is perhaps the detail most easily missed by anyone looking at the medieval diet from a distance, assuming that a life built around wheat, rye, oats and barley must have been a narrow, repetitive one in every sense. In truth, those same handful of grains grown in that same three-field rotation branched outward into nearly everything a peasant family consumed, and understanding just how far that branching extended reshapes the picture considerably. Bread sat at the centre of it, though not the bread most people today would recognise. The finest wheat flour, pale and carefully sifted, belonged almost entirely to the tables of lords' monasteries and the wealthier townspeople who could afford a miller's most refined product. What reached the peasant household was coarser by necessity, often a blend, rather than a single grain rye mixed with wheat in a combination so common across parts of northern Europe that it earned its own name. Maslin, a loaf dense enough to be almost chewable as a meal in itself, dark in colour, heavy in the hand. In leaner years when the harvest ran short, that bread stretched further, still bulked out with barley, with oats. And in genuinely desperate seasons, historians have found evidence in surviving records of bread adulterated with ground peas acorns, or even in the very worst documented famines, with bark and other forage fillers that carried almost no nutritional value at all, but at least gave the illusion and the sensation of a full stomach. The evidence for exactly how frequently this kind of severe adulteration occurred remains incomplete, pieced together from scattered chronicles and the occasional detailed manorial account, but its very existence in the record tells us something important about how thin the margin between a normal loaf and true desperation could be. The same grain that became bread also became something else, something that occupied a role in the medieval diet almost impossible to overstate, and that role was ale. It is worth pausing on this because the numbers involved genuinely surprise most people hearing them for the first time. In medieval England, surviving records from monasteries, manors, and even hospitals suggest an ordinary adult might consume something in the range of a gallon of ale in a single day, and this was not primarily about intoxication. Water in most medieval settlements carried real and constant risk drawn from sources easily contaminated by the same villages and livestock that depended on them. And while medieval people did not understand germ theory in any modern sense, they understood through long observation that ale made from boiled water and fermented grain caused far less sickness than water taken directly from a stream or a shallow well. This ale was typically what historians call small ale or weak ale, brewed with a much lower alcohol content than what we would recognise today, safe enough to serve to children alongside adults, consumed throughout the day almost the way we might drink water now. Brewing itself in most villages fell to women, and a skilled village brewer, often called an alewife, held a position of genuine practical importance in the community, her product safer in a very real sense than the well beside her own door. There is a particular kind of quiet dignity in recognizing what this means. The same grain that filled the cooking pot that became the dense bread on the table also became the safest drink available to an entire household morning meal to evening meal. Nothing in this system was wasted, and very little of it existed by accident. Every use of that grain represented some accumulated piece of practical wisdom tested across generations about how to keep a family fed, and just as critically, keep them from getting sick in the process. And then there was the pottage itself, which we have already begun to understand, but which deserves a closer look now, because it was rarely as simple as grain and water alone. Regional evidence drawn from surviving cookbooks written for wealthier households, but reflecting techniques that clearly filtered down and across social lines, along with archaeological analysis of cooking vessels and their residues, suggests considerable local variation in exactly what filled that pot. In coastal regions, a family within reach of the sea or a substantial river might add fish, dried or salted, to last through the winter months, transforming a grain-based stew into something with real protein. In woodland regions, foraged greens, wild garlic nettles, and various herbs added both flavour, and though no one at the time would have used this language, meaningful nutritional variety, vitamins and minerals that a diet of pure grain alone could not have provided. Pigs, notably cheaper to raise than cattle and requiring less pasture, contributed the occasional piece of salted or smoked pork, particularly around the late autumn slaughter that many households carried out before the depths of winter made feeding an extra animal impractical. This detail alone complicates the popular image of the medieval peasant surviving on grain and grain only. The reality where the record allows us to see it clearly looks more like grain as the reliable foundation, with whatever the immediate landscape offered layered carefully on top. Should we then think of the daily pottage as monotonous, exactly as it is so often described? It is a fair question, and scholars still debate the answer more than a casual glance at the surviving evidence might suggest. On one hand, the base of the meal, the grain and legume core, genuinely repeated day after day with real consistency, and no honest telling of this history should soften that reality. On the other hand, the specific character of that base, its seasoning, its added ingredients, its exact texture and flavour shifted with the calendar in ways a modern eater accustomed to year-round variety might struggle to appreciate, but which would have felt like real meaningful change to the people eating it. A pottage in early spring thickened with the season's first tender greens would have tasted genuinely different from the same base stewed through a long winter, with only dried peas and stored grain for company. The sameness we tend to imagine from a distance may have felt, from inside that world, considerably less uniform than it appears on paper. What remains beyond dispute is the sheer efficiency of this entire arrangement, grain doing the work of bread, of drink, and of the daily meal, all at once, drawing every possible use from a resource that had cost enormous labour to grow, and that carried always the ever-present risk of a failed harvest hanging somewhere in the background. It is a system built not around comfort or variety for their own sake, but around resilience, around wringing every measure of nourishment and safety out of what the land and the labour of an entire household could produce. That resilience, though, was never absolute, and it never could be. A system this finely tuned to ordinary conditions carries within it a particular fragility, one that reveals itself only when conditions stop being ordinary, when the rains that should fall in spring do not come or come without ceasing, and the careful balance this whole way of life depended upon begins quietly at first to buckle. Weather in the medieval world was never simply weather. It was the difference between a household that ate through the winter and one that did not, and there is no clearer, more thoroughly documented illustration of that truth than what happened across northern Europe, beginning in the spring of 1315, when the sky itself seemed to turn against the very system we have just spent so long admiring. The rains that year did not stop. Chroniclers writing from monasteries in England, France, as in the Low Countries, describe a spring and summer of near-constant downpour fields so waterlogged that oxen sank to their knees trying to plough them seed grain, rotting in the ground before it could even properly sprout. This was not one bad week or one difficult month. Contemporary accounts and the tree ring and climate data researchers have since pieced together from that period point to roughly 2 years of catastrophically wet cold weather stretching across an enormous portion of the continent. A disruption severe enough that modern historians now regard us as part of the opening edge of what came to be called the Little Ice Age. A centuries-long cooling trend whose earliest and most brutal consequences fell directly onto the fields we have just walked through together. The careful, patient three-field rotation, the accumulated wisdom of generations, had never been built to withstand a failure this total, this sustained, arriving 2 years in a row. What followed has come to be known to historians as the Great Famine, and the surviving evidence for just how severe it became is frankly difficult to sit with even from this distance. Grain prices in parts of England are recorded as having risen to roughly 4 times their normal level within a matter of months, an increase that meant in the most direct and literal sense that families who had managed comfortably in an ordinary year now faced the real close possibility of starvation. Manorial records from this period show a marked rise in what officials described as theft of food peasants driven to stealing grain livestock, even garden vegetables from neighbours who had in most years been the very people they depended on for mutual aid at harvest time. Chroniclers writing with the particular bluntness of men who had witnessed the famine firsthand recorded instances of parents unable to feed their children, of the old quietly stepping back from what little food remained, so the young might have a slightly better chance of communities burying their dead in numbers that overwhelmed the usual quiet rhythms of a parish churchyard. Some accounts from the period, more difficult still to read, describe communities so reduced by hunger that they turned to eating draft animals essential to the next year's ploughing, a decision that offered a small mercy in the immediate present and very likely deepened the crisis that followed, because a family without an ox to pull a plough faced the next planting season with even less than they had going into this one. It's worth pausing here on something that easily gets lost in broad historical summary, and that is the sheer scale of what this famine actually meant in terms of human loss. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 10 and 15% of the population across the worst affected regions of Northern Europe may have died as a direct or indirect result of the Great Famine between 1315 and 1317, a staggering figure for what is, in the wider arc of medieval history, sometimes treated as little more than a footnote before the far more famous catastrophe of the plague that would follow a generation later. The evidence for a precise death toll remains genuinely incomplete, drawn from a patchwork of parish records, monastic chronicles, and tax rolls that survive unevenly from place to place. And scholars still debate how far these regional figures can be responsibly extended to describe the continent as a whole. But even the more conservative estimates describe a demographic wound of extraordinary depth inflicted not by war, not by plague, but by 2 consecutive years of the wrong kind of weather falling on a system that had almost no capacity to absorb a shock of that magnitude. Why did a system this carefully refined, this patiently built across generations of accumulated agricultural knowledge, prove so completely unable to withstand it? The uncomfortable answer researchers have gradually assembled is that the very efficiency we admired in the fields just now was also in a very real sense the source of its fragility. A system built to produce exactly enough, extracting every reasonable measure of nourishment from the land while leaving almost nothing held back in true reserve, has very little room left to absorb a genuine crisis. Most peasant households, historians estimate, carried perhaps a few weeks or at most a couple of months of true surplus grain in storage during an ordinary year, enough to smooth over a modestly poor harvest but nowhere close to enough to survive 2 consecutive catastrophic ones. Add to this the structural demands we spoke of earlier, the tithes and rents owed regardless of how the harvest had actually gone, Obligations that in many recorded instances continued to be collected even during the worst months of the famine, and you begin to see how a system finely tuned for ordinary resilience could collapse so completely once ordinary conditions simply stopped applying. There is a detail from this period that rarely makes it into popular retellings of medieval history, and it concerns the church's own uneven response to what was unfolding. Some monasteries and religious houses, particularly those holding significant grain reserves, opened those stores to feed starving villagers nearby, and several surviving accounts describe genuine, well-documented acts of charity carried out by individual abbots and local clergy who used their institution's resources to meaningfully soften the famine's edge within their reach. Other religious institutions, the record shows with equal clarity, continued collecting tithes with the same rigour as any ordinary year. A contrast that did not go unremarked, while even at the time appearing in the more pointed chronicles and sermons written in the famine's immediate aftermath. It is a reminder that no single institution, medieval or otherwise, responded to catastrophe with one uniform voice, and that the true texture of this history sits, as it so often does, somewhere in the space between simple villains and simple heroes. And yet even inside a catastrophe this severe, the historical record preserves something that deserves to be spoken alongside the suffering, and that is the sheer quiet persistence of ordinary people finding ways to endure it. Village communities pooled what little remained among households in genuine hardship in patterns visible in surviving local records of shared grain distribution during the worst months. Families adapted what they ate in ways the normal calendar would never have required, foraging further from home, experimenting with substitute ingredients out of necessity that would never have appeared in an ordinary year's pot. The famine passed eventually, as even the worst famines do the weather, gradually returning to something closer to its earlier pattern, the fields slowly beginning to recover their old rhythm. But the underlying vulnerability the Great Famine exposed, the thinness of the margin between an ordinary meal and true starvation, did not simply disappear once the rain stopped. It settled into the collective memory of an entire generation, and it would not be the last time that same fragile margin was tested, nor would the next test when it came arrive by weather alone. Even in the best of years, long before any famine tested the system to its breaking point, hunger was never entirely absent from the medieval calendar. It arrived on a schedule of its own, quiet and predictable enough that the people living through it gave it a name, and understanding that recurring ordinary hunger tells us something the extraordinary catastrophe of a famine year cannot, because it shows us what survival actually cost even when nothing had gone dramatically wrong. Historians studying the agricultural calendar of medieval Europe use the term the hungry gap to describe the weeks stretching roughly from late spring into early summer, the period after the previous autumn's stored grain had been largely consumed, but before the new harvest was ready to bring in. This gap was not a failure of the system, it was in a strange way built into it, an entirely predictable consequence of a calendar in which grain could only be harvested once or twice a year, and had to somehow stretch across every week in between. In an ordinary year with an ordinary harvest behind them, most households could manage this stretch without true crisis tightening, portions relying more heavily on whatever early greens the garden offered, drawing down reserves they had deliberately husbanded through the winter for exactly this purpose. But manage is a careful word here, and it did not mean comfort. Surviving manorial records from this period of the year show measurable declines in recorded labour output, workers moving more slowly, accomplishing less in a day's assigned task. A pattern modern historians studying these documents attribute in large part to simple caloric shortfall bodies, running on less fuel than the physical demands of farm labour actually required. What did this kind of chronic seasonal undernourishment actually do to a person across the span of an entire life, lived this way? This is where the evidence becomes genuinely stirring, and where the picture that emerges is less about dramatic starvation and more about a slower, quieter toll, one written into the body itself over years rather than weeks. Estimates drawn from tax records, manorial court rolls, and the occasional detailed parish accounts suggest that life expectancy for the medieval peasantry, once you account for the very high rate of death in infancy and early childhood, likely settled somewhere in a range that would strike a modern reader as remarkably short often, not much beyond the 4th or 5th decade of life for those who survive childhood at all. The reasons behind this were never singular. Disease, unsanitary conditions, and the physical dangers of manual agricultural labour all played their part, and scholars still debate precisely how large a role chronic low-grade malnutrition played relative to these other factors, since the surviving documentary evidence rarely separates cause of death with the precision a modern researcher would want. But the caloric mathematics involved are not seriously in dispute. A single adult engaged in the kind of sustained physical labour. Medieval agriculture demanded ploughing, threshing, hauling, needed a substantial daily caloric intake simply to maintain their own strength, and the evidence suggests that in a meaningful number of years across a meaningful portion of the population that need was not fully met. Children bore a particular and especially difficult share of this burden. And the record here, though incomplete, is genuinely difficult to read without feeling its weight. Skeletal evidence recovered from medieval burial sites, which we will look at more closely before long, has repeatedly shown signs of stunted growth and interrupted bone development consistent with periods of significant nutritional stress during childhood, a pattern researchers find not only in years of documented famine but scattered more broadly across ordinary decades as well. Infant and child mortality rates reconstructed from the parish and manorial records that do survive appear to have been extraordinarily high by any modern standard, with a meaningful proportion of children not surviving past their 5th birthday. It would be a mistake to attribute this loss to hunger alone, since disease moved through medieval communities with a speed and lethality no diet could fully guard against, but nutrition and disease resistance are deeply intertwined in ways medieval families understood only intuitively through hard experience rather than through any formal medical knowledge. A weaker, more poorly fed child faced a harder fight against the same illness that a better nourished one might survive. And yet inside this genuinely difficult picture, there is something that deserves to be said with equal honesty because it complicates any simple story of unrelenting deprivation, and it is this. The very system we have spent so long examining, the 3-field rotation, the careful mix of grain, legume, and whatever the immediate landscape offered, appears to have functioned across most ordinary years as a remarkably effective defense against the very worst outcomes. Bioarchaeological studies comparing medieval peasant skeletal remains to those of certain other historical populations have found somewhat counterintuitively evidence of reasonably balanced basic nutrition in years without acute crisis. The steady combination of grain protein, legume protein, and foraged or garden vegetables providing a nutritional floor that, while far from generous, was not nothing. It was not a diet built for abundance, it was a diet built with real and demonstrable success for baseline survival, absorbing the ordinary hardships of a hard physical life while remaining catastrophically vulnerable to the extraordinary ones, the failed harvest, the 2 consecutive wet summers, the sudden collapse of a season the whole calendar depended upon. This tension between a system genuinely well-suited to ordinary endurance and one almost entirely unequipped for extraordinary shock sits at the very heart of what made medieval peasant life what it was. It was not in the way it is sometimes flattened into popular imagination a story of constant unbroken suffering, nor was it in the way certain more romantic retellings prefer to frame it a picture of simple rustic contentment untroubled by real hardship. It was something more specific, and in its own way more human than either extreme a life, built with real skill and real resilience around a margin that was thin enough to hold in an ordinary year, and thin enough to break without warning in an extraordinary one. How do we actually know any of this with the confidence we have just been speaking with, given that the people living this history left behind so little in their own words? No diaries, no personal letters, nothing resembling the kind of first-hand testimony later centuries would provide in abundance. The answer to that question takes us somewhere quite different from the fields and famine records we have walked through so far into the far more intimate and, in its own way, more startling evidence that has only become available to historians within living memory, written not in ink but in bone. A skeleton to someone who has never studied one closely might seem like a poor witness. It cannot speak, cannot explain itself, cannot tell you what it thought or feared or hoped for on an ordinary Tuesday 600 years ago. And yet to the particular branch of science that has grown up around the careful study of old bone, a skeleton turns out to be an extraordinarily honest witness, one that cannot exaggerate, cannot flatter its own memory, cannot leave out the parts of the story that reflect poorly on the life it lived. It simply records in slow biological detail exactly what happened to the body that carried it. The field responsible for reading this record is called bioarchaeology, and its methods have advanced dramatically within the working lifetime of many historians still active today, which is worth pausing on because it means much of what we're about to describe was genuinely unknown or knowable only in rough approximation as recently as a few decades ago. Researchers examining medieval skeletal remains look first at growth itself, measuring long bones such as the femur against known patterns of healthy childhood development and comparing the results against skeletons from other periods and populations. What these studies have repeatedly found across excavated medieval cemeteries in England, France and parts of Scandinavia is a population noticeably shorter on average than populations from certain earlier and later periods, a difference researchers attribute in significant part to nutritional stress accumulated during the critical growing years of childhood and adolescence. It is a strange thing to consider that the ordinary hunger of the hungry gap we spoke of repeated year after year across an entire childhood quite literally shaped the physical stature of an entire population, a fact written permanently into bone long after the memory of any particular lean spring had faded. Teeth, it turns out, offer an even more precise kind of testimony, one specific enough to identify individual episodes of hardship within a single life. Dental enamel once formed during childhood does not repair or remodel itself the way bone does, which means that any significant disruption to a child's health during the years their teeth are developing leaves a permanent mark, a thin horizontal band of underdeveloped enamel that researchers call a hypoplastic line. Each line represents a period sometimes lasting only weeks of serious physiological stress, most often linked to malnutrition or severe illness. And by counting and dating these lines within a single set of teeth, researchers can reconstruct something remarkably close to a health history of one particular child, centuries after that child grew into an adult and eventually died. Studies examining medieval skeletal populations have found these lines with striking frequency, evidence of repeated early life stress that appears in a meaningful proportion of individuals recovered from ordinary village cemeteries, not only from sites clearly associated with known famine years. It is one of the more quietly moving details available to us from this entire body of research, the knowledge that we can in a very real sense count the hard years written into a single stranger's smile 6 or 7 centuries after they lived them. Isotope analysis takes this evidence in a different, equally remarkable direction, examining not growth or interruption, but the actual chemical composition of what a person ate across the final years of their life. Bone tissue continuously rebuilds itself, incorporating chemical signatures, particular ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes drawn directly from the food a person consumed. Because different food groups carry subtly different isotopic signatures, plants that use different photosynthetic processes, Animal protein versus plant protein researchers can extract a rib or a tooth from a medieval skeleton and reconstruct with genuine scientific precision the rough balance of that individual's diet in the years before death. What these studies have found across a range of excavated medieval populations broadly confirms the picture. The documentary record already suggested diets dominated heavily by cereal grains, with modest and often seasonally variable contributions from animal protein generally more limited among those buried in simpler graves than among those interred with the markers of greater wealth or status. But isotope studies have also produced some genuinely unexpected findings revealing surprising levels of freshwater or marine fish consumption at certain inland sites long assumed to have relied on grain almost exclusively, evidence that trade networks and local water access shaped medieval diets in more varied and more locally specific ways than a single uniform picture of the peasant table can really capture. The evidence remains incomplete in one particular respect worth acknowledging honestly, and it concerns exactly whose bones survived to be studied in the first place. Burial practices, soil chemistry, and simple accidents of preservation mean that the skeletal record available to researchers is not a perfectly representative sample of the entire medieval population, and the scholars continue to debate how confidently findings from any one excavated cemetery can be extended to describe peasant life more broadly across an entire region or century. A cemetery attached to a wealthier parish church, for instance, may not tell us quite the same story as a more modest rural burial ground, and researchers have learned often through hard experience to be genuinely cautious about generalizing too far from any single site. And yet even with these careful caveats, there is something quietly extraordinary in what this entire body of evidence accomplishes taken as a whole. It allows history to be read from a source its original subjects never intended to leave behind, no chronicle, written by a monk with his own particular biases and blind spots, no manorial account compiled by a lord's official with his own particular interests to protect, but the plain unembellished testimony of the body itself. A hungry spring, a lean winter, a childhood illness survived or not survived, all of it quietly recorded in bone and enamel, waiting patiently across 6 or 7 centuries for a science advanced enough to finally read it back. It is remarkable evidence, and it largely confirms what the written record already suggested about the shape of the medieval peasant life. But bone can only tell us what was eaten and how a body absorbed and responded to it. It cannot tell us who owed what to whom, what a family was permitted to keep for itself after every obligation had been met, or how deliberately their world had been organized around ensuring that grain above all else filled that daily bowl. For that particular layer of the story, we have to turn to a different kind of evidence, entirely one written not into bone, but onto parchment in the careful, deliberate hand of the officials, whose entire job was to make certain nothing owed to a lord ever quietly slipped away unrecorded. Somewhere in an English county archive, or tucked within the vast holdings of a cathedral library, a roll of parchment survives that most visitors would walk straight past without a second glance. It is not beautiful, it carries no illumination, no decorative flourish. Nothing that would draw the eye of anyone looking for the more celebrated treasures of the medieval world. It is in essence a spreadsheet written in cramped Latin abbreviation by a manorial clerk whose name has usually been lost entirely, and it is in its own quiet way one of the most valuable sources historians possess for understanding exactly how peasant families lived, because it was never written with anyone's comfort or memory in mind. It was written to make sure nothing owed to a lord ever escaped notice. These documents, which historians broadly call manorial accounts, though the specific forms varied by region and by period, recorded an extraordinary range of everyday detail with a bureaucratic thoroughness that borders on the astonishing. Court rolls logged the fines and disputes that came before the manor's own local court, offering glimpses into everything from boundary disagreements between neighbouring strips of land to accusations of grain theft during hard years, account rolls tracked, often with genuine precision, exactly how much grain a manor's domaine land produced in a given year, how much was owed in rent by each individual tenant, and how much, if any, fell short. Extents, a particular kind of detailed survey commissioned periodically by a lord's administration, catalogued an entire manor's holdings tenant by tenant, listing the size of each family's strips, the specific obligations attached to them, and occasionally even the livestock a household was recorded as owning. Historians studying these documents describe a genuine sense of discovery in working through them, not because any single entry is dramatic in isolation, but because the accumulated weight of thousands of small, dry, bureaucratic details eventually assembles itself into something remarkably close to a full picture of an ordinary life. One particular type of record deserves special attention here because it speaks directly to the question this entire story has been circling. Tithe records kept by parish churches to track the portion of produce owed to religious institutions occasionally survive in enough detail to show crop by crop exactly what a given community actually harvested in a given year. Where these records survive in unusually rich detail, and it must be said that this is not every parish nor every century, historians have been able to reconstruct something close to an annual accounting of a village's entire agricultural output: oats here, peas there, wheat set aside separately, often in quantities precise enough to calculate roughly how much of each crop an individual household would have kept for itself after every obligation was met. It is from documents exactly like these, cross-referenced carefully against the isotope and skeletal evidence we spoke of earlier, that historians have been able to confirm with a fair degree of confidence just how heavily that daily bowl of pottage leaned on the humbler grains and legumes the land most reliably produced. There is a particular kind of record less well known outside specialist circles that offers something even more surprising, and it concerns what these documents reveal about individual peasant households actively negotiating, resisting, and occasionally outmaneuvering the system that bound them. Court rolls preserve cases of tenants disputing the exact terms of their obligations, sometimes successfully citing established local custom against a lord's attempt to increase what was owed. They record instances of peasants pooling resources to jointly purchase certain rights or privileges from a lord's administration, a small but genuine form of collective bargaining, conducted centuries before that phrase existed. They even preserve in a handful of well-studied manors records of peasant families accumulating enough surplus across good years to purchase additional land outright or to secure their own legal freedom from certain traditional obligations, evidence that the rigid picture of total unbroken subjugation, however dominant it was as a general condition, was not without meaningful exceptions and genuine human agency exercise within its constraints. How reliable is any of this, given that these records were compiled by the very officials whose interests lay in extracting as much as possible from the peasants they were documenting? This is a fair and important question, and it is one historians studying these sources take seriously rather than setting aside. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on several fronts, since manorial clerks had every incentive to record obligations accurately while having considerably less reason to record in any detail the actual condition or well-being of the households they were assessing. Scholars still debate how much these documents may understate genuine hardship in ordinary years, since a peasant family surviving at the very edge of subsistence would leave much the same paper trail as one surviving comfortably, provided both met their formal obligations on schedule. What these records excel at is telling us what was owed, what was produced, and roughly what remained. What they cannot always tell us, and what the skeletal and archaeological evidence must help fill in, is exactly how that remainder actually felt meal after meal inside a single household's daily life. Taken together, though, documentary and physical evidence increasingly corroborate one another in a way that gives historians genuine confidence in the broad outline of this story, even where individual details remain uncertain. The tithe record showing heavy grain and legume production align closely with the isotope evidence showing heavy grain and legume consumption. The court rolls recording theft and hardship during known famine years align closely with the skeletal evidence showing markers concentrated in those same periods. It is rare in historical research for two entirely different categories of evidence. One written by human hands with human motives, the other recorded silently in bone with no motive at all to agree with one another, this consistently, and when they do, it is usually a sign that the picture emerging from them is a genuinely reliable one. And yet for all this agreement on the broad shape of the story, historians examining this same body of evidence have not reached anything close to full consensus on every question it raises, and it is to that quieter, more scholarly disagreement, the parts of this history that remain genuinely, honestly unsettled, that our attention turns next. Historians, it turns out, are not nearly as unified on the subject of medieval peasant food as a single confident documentary might suggest, and there is real value in sitting honestly with where their disagreements actually lie, because it tells us something important about how history itself gets built, one careful contested argument at a time. The most persistent of these debates concerns a question that sounds simple but proves remarkably difficult to answer with real precision, and it is this. Just how monotonous was the medieval peasant diet in actual daily experience compared to how monotonous it appears when reduced to a summary on a page? For much of the 20th century, the dominant scholarly picture leaned heavily toward genuine grinding sameness, an image shaped in large part by the documentary sources available at the time, tithe records and manorial accounts that by their very nature tend to record broad categories of grain and produce, rather than the specific small-scale variations a household might have introduced on any given evening. A clerk recording that a village owed its tithe in oats and peas was not, and had no particular reason to be, recording whether that same village also gathered wild garlic along the hedgerows in April, or added river fish to the pot whenever the season allowed it. The written record, in other words, may have quietly flattened a diet that was in practice considerably more textured than the documents alone can show. More recent scholarship, drawing heavily on the archaeological and isotopic evidence we spoke of earlier, has pushed back against that flatter picture in some genuinely interesting ways. Researchers examining plant remains recovered from medieval rural site seeds, husks and pollen preserved in the anaerobic conditions of old wells, ditches and cesspits, have identified a considerably wider range of foraged and cultivated plants entering the medieval diet than the tithe records alone would ever suggest. Wild fruits, a variety of pot herbs and regional specialties that varied meaningfully from one part of a single country to another. This evidence has led a meaningful portion of the current scholarly community toward a somewhat more optimistic reading, one that still fully acknowledges the grain and legume foundation of the daily meal, while arguing that the seasoning, the accompaniments, and the small daily variations layered on top of that foundation gave peasant households considerably more genuine culinary texture than the popular image of an unchanging bowl of grey gruel typically allows. And yet this revised, somewhat gentler picture has its own committed critics within the historical community, and the disagreement between these camps is not simply academic hair-splitting, because it shapes how we understand something genuinely important about the texture of ordinary human life across an entire era. Scholars more skeptical of the revised viewpoint out reasonably that archaeological evidence of forage plants tells us these foods were available and occasionally consumed somewhere in a region, but cannot always tell us how frequently any single household actually incorporated them into an everyday meal, versus reserving them for particular seasons, particular celebrations, or particular years of unusual scarcity, when foraging became less an enhancement and more a necessity. A handful of preserved elderberry seeds in a cesspit, in other words, might represent a rich and varied culinary tradition, or it might represent a single desperate autumn when the usual harvest fell short. The evidence remains genuinely incomplete on this exact point, and honest scholars on both sides of the debate acknowledge as much rather than overstating what a given archaeological find can actually prove. A second closely related disagreement concerns regional variation and how far any single description of the peasant diet, including much of what this very story has described tonight, can responsibly be applied across the enormous geographic and cultural range of medieval Europe as a whole. A household working land in the damp, temperate Midlands of England lived under meaningfully different conditions than one working the drier, more Mediterranean soil of southern Italy or the colder, more forest-dense landscape of parts of Poland and the Baltic region. Crops that dominated one region's rotation might be entirely absent from another's, and the balance between grain, legume and foraged food shifted accordingly. Some historians argue strongly for treating medieval peasant diet as a genuinely continent-wide phenomenon built around shared underlying principles, even where specific ingredients varied. Others argue with equal conviction that this kind of broad generalization risks flattening centuries of genuinely distinct regional experience into a single oversimplified narrative that does a disservice to the real diversity of medieval rural life. Both positions, it is worth saying, plainly rest on real evidence and real scholarly care, and the disagreement between them says less about anyone being wrong and more about how difficult it genuinely is to speak responsibly about an era this vast, spanning this many centuries and this many distinct peoples all at once. There is a third area of quieter but no less genuine debate, one that touches directly on class and social variation within the peasantry itself, a group that popular imagination often treats as a single undifferentiated mass, but which the documentary record shows to have been considerably more stratified than that. A free tenant farmer, holding a reasonably sized plot under favourable terms, lived a materially different life from a landless labourer working for wages or partial shares on someone else's strips, and the surviving evidence suggests these differences showed up directly on the table in the frequency of meat, in the quality and freshness of what filled the daily pottage, in the ability to weather a single bad season without real crise. Should we speak, then, of a single medieval peasant diet at all, or of a range of related but genuinely distinct diets shaped as much by a household's specific place within the peasantry's own internal hierarchy as by the broader system of manorial obligation we described earlier? Scholars continue to refine this picture as more localized granular studies of individual manners and individual archaeological sites slowly accumulate each one, adding a small piece to a mosaic that may never be fully complete, but which grows steadily richer and more precise with each careful new study. What emerges from all of this honest disagreement is not a story weakened by uncertainty, but one strengthened by it, a reminder that real history, unlike the tidy version so often presented in passing, is built through ongoing careful argument among people who have devoted entire careers to getting the details right, even when getting them entirely right remains for now just out of reach. The broad shape of that daily bowl grain and legume at its heart shaped by land obligation and season stands on genuinely solid evidentiary ground. The finer texture within that shape, exactly how varied, exactly how regionally distinct, exactly how different from one household to the next, remains a living conversation among the people still carefully reading the bones, the parchment, and the quiet, patient soil itself. That conversation and that entire careful world of obligation and rotation and daily survival was about to be interrupted by something far larger and far more sudden than any famine or any scholarly debate, an event that would not simply strain the system, we have spent so long describing but would tear directly through the population sustaining it, and in doing so, would quietly and permanently change what filled that bowl for everyone who survived to see the other side of it. By the late autumn of 1347, ships arriving at the port of Messina in Sicily carried something far more dangerous than any cargo listed on their manifests. Within months, what these ships had unknowingly brought ashore was moving inland along the same trade routes that had for generations carried grain, wool and coin across the continent, and by the time it finally receded years later, it had reshaped Europe so completely that the careful agricultural world we have spent so long describing tonight would never fully return to what it had been before. The disease itself, now generally understood by most researchers to have been caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though this identification and the precise mechanics of its spread across medieval Europe remain subjects of ongoing scientific and historical refinement, moved with a speed that genuinely overwhelmed the medieval world's capacity to comprehend, let alone resist it. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in the middle of what they had no way of knowing, would later be called the Black Death, describe entire villages falling stagnant within weeks, fields left unharvested because there was no one remaining strong enough or willing enough to bring in a crop that might carry the same contagion that had already claimed a household's parents, children and neighbours. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 1/3 and perhaps as much as half of Europe's entire population died within the initial wave of the plague between 1347 and 1351, a demographic collapse so severe and so sudden that it has few genuine parallels anywhere else in the historical record, and one that struck the very rural agricultural population whose labour the entire manorial system we have described tonight depended upon completely. What followed, though, tells a story that complicates any simple picture of the plague as pure, unrelenting catastrophe, because for the peasants who survived it, and a great many did the years immediately after, the worst of the dying brought something few of their ancestors would ever have recognized: a genuine and dramatic improvement in their material circumstances. The mechanism behind this shift is at its core a matter of simple and rather brutal economics. With a third or more of the agricultural workforce suddenly gone, the labour that remained became almost overnight extraordinarily valuable in a way it had never been under the old system of obligation and abundance we described earlier. Manorial records from across England, France, and much of Western Europe in the decades following the plague show lords facing labour shortages so severe that long-standing custom began to bend in ways that would have seemed unthinkable only a generation before. Wages for hired agricultural labour rose sharply in some well-documented English manors by something approaching 50% within just a few decades, as lords found themselves genuinely competing with one another for a suddenly scarce workforce. Peasants who had once been bound tightly to a single manor by custom and obligation increasingly found themselves able to negotiate, to relocate to land offering better terms, or simply to demand wages and conditions their grandparents could never have imagined asking for. Land itself paradoxically became more available to the peasants who survived for the grimmest of reasons. Entire families, and in some documented cases entire villages, had been wiped out completely, leaving their strips of land vacant and their obligations effectively void. Surviving tenants and the children of the dead found themselves in a position to acquire additional acreage, sometimes simply by taking up abandoned strips that no living claimant remained to work, sometimes through more formal arrangements with lords desperate to keep any land at all under productive cultivation rather than let it lie fallow and unprofitable. Historians studying manorial records from this period describe surviving peasant households across many regions holding measurably more land per family in the decades after the plague than had been typical before it, a shift with direct and meaningful consequences for what those households could grow and ultimately what filled their bowl each evening. This is where the story of that daily meal finally begins to change in a genuinely significant way after centuries of remarkable consistency. With more land per surviving household and crucially with fewer mouths competing for the same overall agricultural output across the population as a whole, per capita food availability improved measurably in the decades following the plague. Historians studying meat consumption in particular, drawing on a combination of manorial records, household accounts and archaeological evidence from animal bone deposits at rural sites, have identified what appears to be a genuine and sustained increase in meat eaten by ordinary peasant households in the century or so following the Black Death. A shift substantial enough that some economic historians have described this period as something close to a golden age for the surviving European peasantry, at least in relative terms, compared to the tighter margins of the centuries immediately preceding it. Pasture land no longer needed to feed as dense a population through grain alone, increasingly supported more livestock, and that livestock in turn increasingly found its way into the pot. It would be a genuine distortion, though, to describe this shift as simple, uncomplicated good news arriving out of catastrophe, and careful historians are quick to resist that framing. The scale of death that produced these improved conditions represents one of the greatest human losses in recorded history, and no later economic benefit erases or excuses the scale of that loss felt individually, household by household, grief by grief across an entire continent. Nor was the improvement in peasant conditions universally welcomed by those who held power over them. Surviving records show lords and royal governments across much of Europe attempting, often with real legal force, to hold wages down and bind peasants back to their previous obligations. Legislation such as England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, representing a direct and largely unsuccessful attempt to legally freeze the old system in place, even as the underlying economic reality had already shifted decisively beneath it. Scholars still debate exactly how much genuine, lasting change in peasant status and freedom can be attributed directly to the plague itself, as opposed to longer, slower economic trends that were already quietly underway before 1347 and simply accelerated by the sudden demographic shock that followed. The evidence points clearly toward genuine improvement in material conditions for many surviving peasant households, but the precise mechanisms and how evenly that improvement was actually distributed across different regions and different ranks within the peasantry itself remains an active and genuinely unresolved area of historical research. What we can say with real confidence is this: the daily bowl that had remained so remarkably consistent across so many preceding centuries, shaped by the tight, unforgiving mathematics of land, obligation and season, finally began to change, not because the underlying agricultural knowledge had shifted, but because the terrible arithmetic surrounding that knowledge had shifted instead. Fewer people working land that had grown more generous per surviving household, eating from a table that could finally, for the first time in living memory, offer something closer to abundance rather than mere sufficiency. That change did not happen all at once, and it did not happen everywhere in quite the same way or at quite the same pace. But it marks in a very real sense the beginning of the end for the world. This entire story has been describing a world in which that single unchanging meal was not simply a habit, but the precise calculated edge of survival itself. What that world eventually gave way to and how much of it quietly still lingers in the food eaten across Europe today is where this long night's journey finally turns toward its close. Somewhere in a kitchen today in a farmhouse in the French countryside or a stone cottage in rural England, a pot of soup sits simmering on a stove thickened with whatever vegetables the week provided, destined to be eaten again tomorrow with a little more added to stretch it further. The cook standing over it almost certainly has no idea that she is participating in her own small and largely unconscious way in a culinary tradition stretching back more than 7 centuries, one that outlived the entire social system that first produced it. This is perhaps the most quietly remarkable part of this whole long story, the sheer persistence of that daily bowl. long after the manorial world that shaped it had begun to fade into memory. As the centuries following the Black unfolded, as serfdom gradually loosened its grip across much of Western Europe, and the rigid obligations we described earlier slowly gave way to more flexible forms of tenancy and wage labour, the underlying pattern of the meal itself did not simply disappear. It evolved, absorbed new ingredients as trade networks expanded and new crops arrived from distant continents and settled region by region into what would eventually become the foundational peasant and working-class cuisines of an entire continent. The thick simmered vegetable and grain stew that fed a bound tenant farmer in the 1300s is a direct culinary ancestor of dishes still eaten with real pride. Today, the French pot-au-feu, the Irish stew built around whatever the season, and the larder allowed the countless regional soups and porridges across Germany, Poland, and the Low Countries that share the same essential logic their medieval predecessors would have recognized instantly: a pot kept going, replenished rather than remade, stretching limited ingredients across as many meals as possible. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, one that food historians have written about with real thoughtfulness, and it concerns how thoroughly the meaning of this style of cooking has inverted itself over the intervening centuries. What began as an arrangement born entirely of necessity, the only realistic way to feed a family on land that offered no guarantees, has in more recent generations been reframed in cookbooks and restaurant menus alike as something closer to virtue. Slow food, peasant cuisine, rustic cooking, terms now often carrying a distinctly positive, even aspirational connotation among people who have never once faced the genuine hunger that originally made such cooking essential rather than fashionable. It would be worth asking gently what the woman we imagined stirring her pot at the very start of this story might make of seeing her daily difficult meal celebrated centuries later as a culinary ideal, served in restaurants at considerable expense to people choosing it freely, rather than out of any genuine necessity at all. Beyond the kitchen itself, the agricultural knowledge embedded in that daily meal left a mark on the European landscape that persists in ways many people walking through the countryside today never fully register. Field patterns established under the medieval three-field rotation remain visible in the shape of farmland across significant stretches of England, France and Germany. Long thin strips and particular boundary lines that trace directly back to divisions first laid out by peasant communities working communally organised open fields many centuries ago. Patterns that later enclosure movements reshaped in some regions but never entirely erased in others. Agricultural historians studying crop rotation practices note, with a certain quiet appreciation, that the basic underlying principle medieval farmers arrived at through pure accumulated observation, the value of alternating grain crops with nitrogen-restoring legumes, remains a foundational concept in modern sustainable and organic farming, today rediscovered and scientifically validated by 20th century agronomists who are, in a very real sense, simply catching up to wisdom medieval peasants had already built into their fields hundreds of years before any of them understood why it worked. The story of that daily bowl also left something behind in language itself, a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people encountering it for the first time. The English word pottage and its close relative porridge descend directly from the medieval term for exactly the kind of thick grain and vegetable stew we have spent this entire evening exploring, and traces of that same linguistic ancestry echo through related words still used casually today, without most speakers ever pausing to consider their origin. Even the phrase mess of pottage, drawn from an old biblical story and still occasionally used in English to describe something of real value, carelessly traded away for something of lesser, more immediate worth, carries within it a faint linguistic memory of just how central that humble bowl once was to an entire way of life. Valuable enough that giving it up, even for something that seemed appealing in the moment, was remembered for generations afterward as a genuine and cautionary loss. Not every legacy of this period is quite so gentle to consider, and honest history requires sitting with that too. The centuries of chronic seasonal undernourishment we described earlier, the hungry gap repeating year after year across an entire population, appear to have left a mark not only on individual bodies, but potentially some researchers argue on longer patterns of health and development that echoed forward across subsequent generations. Though the evidence for exactly how far these effects genuinely persisted, and through what specific biological or social mechanisms, remains an area where scholars are notably cautious, unwilling to draw firmer conclusions than the available evidence can properly support. What is not in dispute is the simple, sobering fact that an entire population's height, health, and life expectancy were measurably shaped by centuries of a diet built around bare sufficiency rather than genuine abundance. A reality written permanently into the archaeological record we examined earlier, and one that reminds us just how directly food, or the lack of it, shapes not only individual lives but the trajectory of an entire people across generations. And yet, if we widen the lens one final time before this long night's journey draws toward its close, there is something in this story that reaches well beyond the specific history of medieval Europe, something closer to a quiet universal truth about how ordinary people have always managed to endure the world's hardest arithmetic. That daily bowl was never simply food. It was accumulated knowledge, tested across generations, refined through hard experience rather than formal science, adapted patiently to a landscape and a climate that offered no guarantees. It was resilience made edible, a small repeated act of quiet competence performed by people history rarely names individually people who left behind. No letters, no portraits, no monuments, and yet who kept an entire continent fed year after difficult year through nothing more than careful attention to their own land and an unglamorous willingness to eat the same meal again tomorrow and the day after that, for as long as it took to see their children safely into another spring. We are close now to the end of this particular story, close to setting down for tonight the pot we picked up together at the very beginning. But before we let that fire finally burn low, there is one last image worth carrying with us, one final quiet thread, connecting that distant medieval hearth to something closer, something almost startlingly near to the life many of us still live today, whether we have ever paused to notice the connection or not. There is a kind of soup still made across much of Northern Europe today that carries a name most people who eat it have never thought to question. In parts of Germany it appears as in Topf, literally, one pot, a single vessel meal built from whatever the week's ingredients allow, simmered together, rather than served as separate courses. In France, the tradition survives in the pot au feu, the pot on the fire, a phrase that could have been lifted directly from the world we have spent this entire night walking through. These are not museum pieces. They are Tuesday dinner cooked without ceremony in kitchens where no one is thinking about the 13th century at all. And yet there they are, an unbroken thread of practical wisdom, stretching from a peasant hearth 700 years ago to a stovetop somewhere tonight, closer to where you are lying right now than you might have expected when we began. We started this story with a woman standing before dawn, coaxing a fire back to life, ladling the same stew into the same bowls she had filled the day before and the day before that. It would have been easy, and it would have been wrong to look at her life and see only deprivation, only a narrow grinding sameness with nothing else worth noticing inside it. What we found instead, once we looked closely enough, once we followed the grain from the field to the pot to the bone and back again, was something far more layered than that first glance allowed. That daily meal was not simply what remained after everything else had been taken. It was intelligence patiently built across generations who left behind no textbooks, no formal science, Nothing but careful observation passed from a mother to a daughter, from one hard season to the next, until an entire continent had quietly taught itself how to survive on soil that offered no guarantees. We saw how thoroughly that meal was shaped by forces far larger than any single household: the manor and its obligations, the church and its tithe, the three-field rotation turning season after season, with a discipline as exacting in its own way as anything a Lord Steward ever recorded. We saw the system tested past its limit when the rains would not stop in 1315, and we sat honestly with what that failure actually cost in bodies and grief, in the quiet arithmetic of who survived and who did not. We read that same story written a second time in bone and enamel, in the careful modern science that can now tell us with real precision exactly how a hungry spring 7 centuries past left its mark on a child's growing teeth, and we watch the entire fragile architecture of obligation crack open when the plague swept through an unimaginable loss that nonetheless left the households who survived it with more land, more meat, and slowly, finally more choice than their grandparents had ever known. What connects all of it? Every layer of this long night's journey is something worth naming plainly before we let it go. It is not really a story about food. It is a story about what ordinary people do when the world offers them very little room for error, and it is a story that repeats itself in different forms in nearly every century of human history. Systems rise refined by patient necessity into something genuinely resilient. Those same systems, stretched too thin by drought or plague or simple bad fortune, buckle under condition they were never built to withstand. And through all of it, the people living inside that system, rarely named, rarely remembered, individually keep finding some way to endure it, to adapt, to pass down whatever small piece of hard-won wisdom might help the next generation manage a little better than the last one did. That pattern did not end with the medieval peasantry. It is in its quiet way still the shape of most human survival in most places across most of history. There is one last piece of evidence worth setting down before we close this story, small and easy to overlook, but strangely moving once you sit with it. Among the surviving manorial records from a modest English village in the years following the worst of the Black Death, a clerk noted the reallocation of a strip of land abandoned when the family who had worked it for 3 generations died within the same terrible month. The entry is brief, unemotional, exactly the kind of dry bureaucratic notation these documents are made of, but historians who have studied it closely point out something the clerk likely never intended to preserve. The new tenant recorded as taking up that strip was a young widow previously landless, now for the first time in her life holding ground of her own. She would go on the later record show to hold that land for decades, to pass it eventually to her own children, to become, in the quiet arithmetic of manorial bookkeeping, simply another name on a rent roll. But for one brief moment, buried in the aftermath of almost unimaginable loss, an ordinary woman's entire future changed, recorded in 6 dry lines of Latin by a clerk who was only ever trying to keep the accounts straight. That is what survived in the end. Not grand pronouncements, not the certainty of hindsight, just small real moments preserved almost by accident in the margins of documents never meant to be read as anything more than a ledger. The fire has burned low now, the way it always does at this hour. Somewhere 7 centuries ago, a pot went cold for the last time in a kitchen we will never know the name of. Somewhere else tonight, another pot is simmering, quietly filled with whatever the week allowed, tended by hands that have no idea how far back this particular kind of patience actually reaches. The meal changes, the hands change, the reasons change, mostly from necessity to habit, from survival to something closer to comfort. But the pot stays on the fire. It always has. And somewhere in that small unbroken thread, stretched thin across 700 years of harvests, good and bad, of famine, and plenty of empires and manors long since turned to grass, There is something that looks, if you sit with it long enough in the dark, very much like the quiet, ordinary shape of how people have always kept each other alive. Rest now. The bowl is empty, the fire is low. The story ends here.